All right, this is the August Men's Room webinar, and I am here with Frank Kermit. Frank, you there?
Oh, yeah, I'm here. How you doing?
I'm doing good, Frank. Thanks for joining me on the call today. Unfortunately, Mark's not able to join us, but we're really happy to have you here.
I'm happy to be here. Let's get started, dude.
All right, perfect. So we were talking to you last month, and I thought this month one of the things that we would talk about is something that you've touched on quite a few times in some of the conversations that we've had in the past, which is the power of storytelling.
Storytelling happens to be one of my more popular programs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's probably because people really find they get a lot of results using storytelling.
Most people think that storytelling is about entertaining, and that's one of the first things that I want to point out. You are not there to entertain anybody when you are storytelling. You are there to connect with them. You're there to communicate emotions, ideas, elements of yourself that you need them to know about you, like what your deal breakers are, what your rules are. Through storytelling, you're also letting anybody you're talking to know what it is you can offer them without just being a direct bragger about it. So that's the first thing. You are not there to entertain anybody with your stories. Entertaining through storytelling is like a side effect, but it's not your primary focus.
Right. So what would you say the importance of storytelling is?
Storytelling is a way of communicating ideas and your, things about yourself without being so direct about it. And it just, how do I say this? It's a softener of sorts. Now, I could tell you that I happen to believe in, chivalry. Now, am I going to say just right off the bat, well, I believe in chivalry? Not very effective, because it makes people wonder, does he really believe in chivalry, or is he just saying so? Or I could tell you a story. From the time I was very young, I remember that I was always opening the door for people, and usually I would open the door for older people if they're walking with a cane. It's just the idea that I don't have to do it, I choose to do it. And doing something like that's very important to me. Now, which is more effective? Simply saying, I believe in chivalry, or telling a story about from the time that I was young, this is what I would do, this is why I do it, this is why it's important to me, and this is why you should care.
Well, what I think is interesting is that people generally, tend to make their own conclusions when they've met somebody for the first time. And when you sort of open the door to allow them to make their own conclusions as opposed to telling them what you think they should be hearing, they're a lot more open and a lot more receptive to agree with you.
Exactly. If you go up to anybody and you say, this is the way I am, the first thought that's going to go through their minds is, how do I know you're telling the truth? Prove it. However, if I'm simply telling a story, like you said, they are going to make their own conclusions because they've got the evidence. So I don't have to say that I believe in chivalry. They'll turn around and say to me, wow, you really believe in chivalry then? Well, yeah, I do, actually. How did you? Oh, yeah, you heard my story. Okay, never mind.
Right. So how does one become a good storyteller? Because it seems like a little bit of an art.
It is an art. My background is in the field of communications and theater, as we talked about in the last webinar. And it's something that develops over time. But I'm going to give you some very specific points right now to turn anybody into a half-decent storyteller just in starting out.
All right.
First element, the very first element of storytelling is the idea of themes. You know how some guys say that, oh, I run out of material to talk about? Okay, this idea of understanding themes is going to solve that problem. So anybody who's listening to this, if you have a problem where you keep running out of things to talk about, just study this next part for the next 5 minutes. You won't run out of things to talk about anymore. Here it is. In any story you tell, there's going to be a number of different themes. When you're moving on from story to story, whether it's the story of the person you're talking to and relating it to one of your own, or multiple stories coming in from your own life, you're not relating the stories based on the story title or the fact that it has a common element. You're relating it through its common theme. So that's all the theory. Now we're going to get into the practical application. Mike, I'm going to ask you to follow my lead on this one. I'm going to recite a nursery rhyme, and I want you to tell me Out of this 4 or 5 sentence nursery rhyme, how many themes come into your head? Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right. The nursery rhyme is Hickory Dock. Here we go. I'm going to recite the nursery rhyme for those people listening who've never heard it. Just tune in right now. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse went up the clock. The clock struck 1. The mouse ran down. Hickory dickory dock. What are the themes?
Well, I got certainly a theme of the nursery rhyme. I got the theme of time with the clock.
All right.
I got the theme of animals or pets with the mouse.
Okay.
And I got the theme of action or sport, or because the mouse was running.
Okay, so let's start with those 4 themes. Just out of curiosity, you think you could pull out a couple of more? Let me read it to you again.
Okay.
And for those of you listening out there, grab a pen, grab some paper. That's the type of interview this is going to be. I'm going to give you this themes. You've already got 4 great ones there. Let's see if there's more.
All right.
Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck 1. The mouse ran down. Hickory dickory dock. What are some additional themes?
Well, there's certainly some a theme in around the idea of the clock striking 1 and the mouse running down, as opposed to what that specifically relates to. It's not clear, but I definitely got some kind of theme there around the 1 being significant.
Okay. What else?
I'm not sure, Frank. I think that's about it for me.
Okay, so let's see what else we can pull out of there. Hickory dickory dock. We've got the idea of words that sound alike. You have hickory and dickory, which are rhyming words, and dickory and dock, words that begin with the letter D, sing-sounding words.
Right.
So we can go into the whole idea of tongue twisters. We can go into other nursery rhymes like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. You go into the letter D, and then, it reminds me of some Sesame Street poems of using the letter D. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. The idea of mice infestation, pest infestation. Stuff that's going on in every major city right now is you have pests like bed bugs and whatnot infesting everything. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing you could pull out of there. The clock struck 1. Now, you've already talked about the idea of the clock striking 1. 1 being everybody wants to be a number 1, getting to the top. Being number 1 is another thing that it's an offshoot. The mouse ran down. Okay, mouse is running away from time. Biological clock, your time is running out. Better hurry, better get moving. You talked about action, so there's another theme in there. Now, your very first theme was the idea of nursery rhymes, so you could relate it to any other nursery rhyme you've ever grew up listening to. Mm-hmm. So if the conversation was, hey, you know what? I was listening to this webinar on the internet, and this guy started saying hickory dickory dock. I had ears. Now you've got a topic of conversation. We've identified all the different themes that can grow from that conversation, which means you start talking about hickory dickory dock. The next conversation could be about people feeling like time is running out, knowing how life is precious, making every moment count. Now, when you're talking to a girl on a date and you're talking about how time is so precious, we have to make every minute count. You could turn a blasé date into something a little bit more intimate, a little bit more romantic. Mm-hmm. Talking about mice, since we started talking about hickory dickory dock. And that reminds me, I had a friend of mine who used to have pet mice. I've never, I understand having a dog, I understand having a cat, but a pet mouse? Why is it that, when mice are living in the streets and your walls, are considered pests and rodents, but if they're in an aquarium of some sort or a mouse cage, they're considered a cute pet? There's another theme, the idea of, the good pet versus the bad pet, and how an environment can change everything. And speaking about how environments change things, is this how I met at the location, and there was so much going around, and we were still able to meet up and connect, and now we're in a different environment, and we're able to connect so much better because we have a level of intimacy here that we didn't have before.
Mm-hmm.
One thing has nothing to do with the other. Me being on a date with a girl having an intimate moment has nothing to do with Hickory Dickory Dock, the nursery rhyme. However, if we connect it through themes, this is a calibrated way to allow a conversation to flow. And if you know which themes you want to lead to, you are now leading the conversation to having a more romantic connection.
Now, should the idea be that you're leading towards themes that you're familiar with, or leading towards themes that might elicit certain states inside of her?
Okay, that's a hard question. Now, obviously, people are going to want to go to the themes they're more familiar with. I think, however, that if you're on a date and you want to use storytelling in the context of a date, you should be leading to things that are going to put her in the right state of mind to have a romantic connection with you. Mm-hmm. So, give me a theme that, you would know nothing about, and I'll show you how to relate it.
Okay. I don't know anything about, let's say, woodworking.
Woodworking, okay. You know nothing about woodworking?
Not really, no.
Okay. Let's start off with any information you might know about woodworking. How would you define woodworking?
I would define woodworking, and I would add maybe carpentry into there as the idea of creating something through wood and the utilization of tools to create some sort of structure, some sort of...
Okay, you've said enough. It's the idea of using creativity and tools. Mm-hmm. Okay, you may not know anything about woodworking, but the idea, the theme of using creativity and tools. What part of your life do you use creativity and tools?
Pretty much every part of my life, including doing the men's room.
Okay, you do the men's room, and this is a place where you use creativity and tools. What are some of the tools you use to produce the men's room?
All the technical tools, editing, camera, lighting, as well as the online tools.
Okay, that's more than enough. Enough. All right, where's the creativity come in? I mean, aren't you just interviewing a bunch of people?
Certainly in creating the structure for the show and coming up with the set designs and coming up with the logo and creating all the materials.
Right now, you have identified a number of themes, the idea of creativity and using tools. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if you don't know anything about woodworking. You already have something in common with a person whose entire life is based on woodworking. Not because you know anything about woodworking, but because you can relate to the themes of somebody doing woodworking.
Right.
You don't have to you don't have to like the same things. You don't have to find someone in the same profession. You have to look at the underlying themes. And once you can connect on those themes, that's where you build an emotional connection with this person.
That's a great point, Frank. So is there anything else in terms of being able to become a good storyteller that you can utilize to help create these dynamic stories?
Okay, well, now that you understand themes and how you would relate themes from one story to the other, I can give you elements of my own storytelling structure that I teach.
Okay.
One of the first thing is make use of a person's senses. So you have the 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. In any story you tell, you want your descriptions to be sensory rich. I don't even think I said that right. Sensory rich? Mm-hmm. Sensory rich. Don't just tell me that you really like the vacation place because it's a cool place to go. Tell me about what you saw. Tell me about the sounds that you heard. Tell me about the smells in the air. If you tasted something very unique in that area, what did it taste like? What were some of the tactile sensations, since we're talking about touch? Here we're talking about temperature. Did it feel rough? Were you feeling the grainy sand or the cool water against your body? Once you describe things using sensory-rich descriptions, you are automatically leading the conversation, because in order for the person to understand what it is you're saying, they have to somewhat relate their own experiences to the last time they felt those sensory stimulations.
And I think that certainly allows them to connect with the story more, because they're able to make a picture. They're able to have more of an experience with it and imagine what it might be like for themselves to be there.
Exactly. Eventually, when you get into advanced storytelling, you're going to be able to incorporate the visual words, the sound words, the kinesthetic words, which is your taste, smell, and touch, and you'll be able to put them all into one sentence, so that when you're talking to a group of people, it doesn't matter if they're more auditory, if they're more visual, if they're more kinesthetic. One sentence that has a little bit of each word will get everybody intrigued with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an example. Can you see how this sounds like an idea that feels right? That one sentence, I'll say it again. See if you can spot the sight words, the sound words, the touch words. Can you see how that sounds like an idea that feels right?
Mm-hmm.
In that one sentence, I talked about, can you see? So if the person likes talking about visual or stimuli, you've got them on board. How that sounds like, now if the person really likes to listen to things, if they're not talkers, but they like to receive sound stimuli, maybe they're really into music, you've got them on board. That feels right. All the kinesthetic people, the ones who, need to feel grounded and like to get a grasp on things, they're on board too.
Mm-hmm. Now, anything else besides, so we've got our themes, and we're engaging the senses with using descriptive words. Mm-hmm. What else might we do?
Okay, in every story, you want to get something in there for the thinkers. You might meet people who are not comfortable with emotions, and telling a story that's all emotion-based is going to make the thinkers feel uncomfortable. You're going to lose them. They may end up trying to sabotage your efforts in communicating and connecting with other people. So stick a line in that story that talks about how you think about something using non-emotional words. When I ponder the situation, I can analyze how this experience might turn out. Mm-hmm. In that one sentence, I'm talking all about the brain, all about the considerations, the analysis. I'm not talking about anything emotional. So let's say you're talking to a small group of people. Let's say you're talking to 3 people. And you start using emotionally rich descriptions, and one person just seems really bored. Throw in a line that would appeal to thinkers. And if that person turns around and says, I know exactly what you mean, I was thinking the same thing. Now you've got the thinkers on board, and now they're on your side.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you're an advocate, Frank, of doing your homework and doing your prep work and making sure that you've got all your ducks in a row. And in terms of doing stories and creating stories, are you also an advocate of pre-writing stories and coming up with ideas and making sure that they contain and that they're simulating all these senses and that they've got all the auditory and the kinesthetic and the visual words in there, and they're also appealing to the auditory digital people that are thinkers? Is it important to construct these stories ahead of time? Or
100%.
Okay.
You have to.
Okay.
When someone is starting out, the whole reason that you're on this journey to begin with is that you don't have these skills naturally. If you had the skills naturally, you wouldn't be here. So yes, when you're starting out, you write them down. Does that mean that you have to write them down for the rest of your life? No. Once this becomes a habit, that's when you don't have to write them down anymore. But when you're starting out, you probably don't have the skills to wing it, because if you did, you wouldn't be studying it to begin with.
Fair enough. So let me ask you, is the next evolution of that to first calibrate and find out which, whether they are auditory or are visual or are a thinker, and then construct your story around what their preference is?
No, it's the opposite. in the way that I teach it, I'll teach you to pick, let's say, I give you a category, your top 5 best childhood memories. Top 5 best childhood memories. Let's say one of them, well, Mike, can you give me an example of just one best childhood memory that you have?
Sure. I think we talked about it last month. It was getting my red tricycle for the first time.
Great, getting your red tricycle. You'll come up with a story that'll have one sentence for the visual people. What do you see? Well, you see the red tricycle. What other colors do you see? What do you see in your environment? What are some of the smells associated with the red tricycle? Is it new? Do you still smell some of the paint? Do you smell the rubber of the tires? Was it Christmas morning and you're smelling the leftover remnants from the kitchen from breakfast? What are some of the tastes and smells? And I don't know, if you were a kid, did you put the ribbon in your mouth? Was there a particular smell? Was there a particular smell in the room that reminds you of Christmas, like a burning candle or a Christmas tree, if that's where you got it? You know, what did the tricycle feel like in your hand? And you talk about the textile sensations of gripping the handlebars or the cold metal of the tricycle or how soft the seat was. So you go through all of those descriptions. You get a thinker in there, and I was wondering how I would manage to ride this tricycle out on the street and not get hit by a car or something of that nature. You start off with your story being already full. Once you're in a situation, and for the purposes of the men's room, once you're on a date, your first story will have everything in it. When the girl responds to your story, whatever it is that she responds to most, that's when you go into calibration mode. That's when you tell your second story through themes. You find, she talks about from tricycles to the theme of trying new things, and then she talks about a trip that she went on. Oh, the theme that connects it back to a story of yours is your first really great vacation. And now you talk about that second story, but this time, instead of going through the whole story you prepared, that's when you pick and choose different elements.
What I hear you saying, Frank, is that it's important to start off with a story that's filled with all these different senses, and then use that as a calibration tool to identify which sense they identify with most, and then be able to apply that sort of filter, if you will, to all of your other stories and accentuate that one sense that they really identify with.
That's exactly the point I was trying to make. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, so if we're creating a good story here, we're understanding the themes, we're really building in all 5 senses, we're making sure that we've got some auditory digital stuff in there, some facts in there for the thinkers. What else are we doing to create some really great stories?
With each story, every story should remind you of another story that you've prepared. So you'll stick in a line, and it makes me remember, and then you talk about another story that you've prepared. So, in your case, your story was getting your very first tricycle. That particular story, does it remind you of any other story in your life?
It reminds me of the time that I used to live in Montreal, Canada, which is where I got that tricycle from.
Okay, so that's the one and only line you need to include in that story. And telling people this story reminds me of the time that I lived in Montreal, Canada, because that's where I got the tricycle. And you need to go back to the first story about the experience of getting the tricycle. Mm-hmm. You've already set it up that if there's ever a lull in the conversation, you can turn around to her and say, I've lived in Montreal, like I told you before, being congruent. You've connected it to something you've already told her, building up the trust between you. Where have you lived? And you get her to talk.
That's good. Just taking some notes here. It's good stuff. Okay, so we're making a connection now to something else, so we can essentially, by utilizing that, never run out of material.
Exactly.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add to creating a good story?
Well, every story should have a lesson.
Okay.
And I learned. Tell me what you learned. What's the deal breaker? What's the lesson in the story? What is the main point of the story that you want to communicate? Now, you talked about getting your first tricycle. What did you learn from that experience?
I learned that when you receive material items, it's not so much about the item itself, it's about the experience that you have with it. That's important.
Very nice.
That's the memory.
Okay, so by telling that to a girl on a date, you've just communicated to her that it's not the material possessions that she should be noticing about what you do and don't give her. It's the experience surrounding those.
Mm-hmm. Which is incredibly valuable because you're essentially conveying what your values are at that point.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's another lesson that somebody could have pulled out of that story? We know what your lesson is, but what's another lesson that somebody could have pulled from the day I got my first tricycle?
Could have been something related to the actual ability to ride the bike itself. And that'd be easy or hard to learn a new skill.
All right. So you learned that riding the bicycle was easy, was harder than it looked, was easier than it looked?
Right. Okay, so just to wrap up then for storytelling, we've got the importance of themes, using all 5 of your senses, incorporating some language for thinkers, and making a connection to other topics and other themes, other stories, and making sure that you include a lesson in them. Is there anything else that completes the structure?
That would be the majority of the structure.
Okay.
Then we have in the way you tell a story.
Right.
The tonality, the body language.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about something that seems to be quite popular in storytelling, and that's the idea of using loops and open loops. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. Ask away.
Okay, so I think the idea, at least as we understand it for loops, is to have multiple stories and to thread them together so that you don't actually finish the story. You'll take a break, maybe halfway or 3/4 of the way through the story. And that reminds me of start another story, and then what you're doing is essentially stacking the stories, and then you then wrap them up again. So in terms of your understanding of that technique, how do you find it to be effective in terms of telling stories?
In my experience, that hasn't worked that well for me, to be honest.
Okay.
And I find that the people who are good with leaving a particular story, moving on to another one, moving on to another one, moving on to another one, moving on, and sometimes not getting back to some of the original stories, it works on a certain type of girl who's high energy, has a lot of struggle with maintaining focus. I think the words attention deficit disorder come to mind. Mm-hmm. And for the type of women that I like, maintaining a particular story flow so I can, really get deeper into the conversation, that's worked better for me.
Right. I think the importance with doing loops is that you never really want to have more than 3 stories that you're looping. And you do want to make sure that you are closing the loops and you're closing them in the order that you open them. I think that's important to making sure that it's effective.
Yeah, I've actually had someone try the loop theory on me, in practicing storytelling, mm-hmm. and I just started getting annoyed. Right. Because I'm trying to keep track of exactly what's going on. I'm trying to keep track of the stories, and the minute I start getting into, wait a minute. Wait, wasn't this related to that? Oh, you didn't mean it that way? Oh, this is a separate story? I feel like I'm talking to a much older individual who can't keep their thoughts straight.
Right. Okay, well, what about the idea of, and excuse the sort of jargon that we use to sort of understand this, but the idea of DHV and DLV stories or demonstrating higher or lower value within your stories. Do you put any thought into, making sure that you're adding experiences into your stories that may come across as, the girl perceiving you at higher value?
One of the struggles is you always have to remember that depending on the girl, it changes the context and the way the story is expressed. So something that might be demonstrating the guy as, being a really great guy to one girl might make a different type of girl see that guy as creepy. So, there are some women who get off on the idea of a guy publicly embarrassing and humiliating his last girlfriend. There's other women who hear even the slightest thing about that and think, the guy's a creep, get the hell away from me. So right before people start saying, you gotta demonstrate this, greater value or demonstrate the lesser value. I'm looking at it as, put that aside for a second. Give me the story the way you best communicate it, you best reflect it. Once it's out there, tell people your story. If they can find a creepy interpretation of your story that you did not anticipate, that's when you got to change it.
Mm-hmm. And I think you touched on something that's far more powerful than actually, demonstrating higher value in the words that you're using, and that's the way that you tell the story, the tonality, the pauses, the timbre of your voice. Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Sure. When I teach tonality, and I have a background in theater for this, the one thing I learned there is that you use different tonalities depending on the medium. For example, when someone's on a stage, no matter who it is they're talking to on the same stage, they're never facing the person directly. They still have to face the audience. So their body language and the direction of their face, the direction of their eyes, is always towards the audience, even if they're talking to the person to their immediate right or their immediate left. As opposed to television, where you can actually have the people facing one another and being at a slight angle so that the cameras can be set over the shoulder. You do this on the Men's Room show, where in the first season we were sitting in chairs, but we weren't facing each other directly. The chairs were angled more towards the cameras.
That's right.
Okay? In tonality, in theater, you always have to emphasize the things of I and me, and that's great for theater, because you have to communicate the source of that particular idea or whatever the message is. Doesn't work so well when you're talking on a date. So here's what I teach that I found works for me on dates. Whenever you use an emotionally descriptive word, modify your tonality to reflect that emotion. So if you want to talk about feeling sad, you want your voice to sound as if you're feeling sad. And if you want to talk about feeling apprehensive, you really want your voice to carry the tonality of apprehension. And if you want your voice to be feeling happy, you want to communicate a good emotion, you can say it with a smile, so this way it sounds like you're really happy. Those elements have to be part of your story. So if you want to communicate a certain emotion through your stories, during that specific sentence where you're including the word of that emotion, change your tonality to reflect that word. So when you say happy, you actually smile and say happy and raise your voice and modify your body and get your torso out there. And when you want to communicate sadness, you want to sound sad. And then go back into the rest of your story. Now, in the way that I'm describing it to you, it sounds almost, schizophrenic. But that's because we are in the process right now of deconstructing it to understand it. But this is how people talk in genuine conversations. When people just go out there and tell story after story after story, I think you call them canned routines? You come off as a social robot because A, you're not connecting the stories through themes, and B, you're not conveying the emotions that the stories are describing. And that comes off as creepy.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of times we have this idea that every story has to have a happy ending, every story has to be upbeat and positive and energetic, but that's not always necessarily the case. Sometimes you can have effective storytelling where there is a strong lesson that was learned at the end, and maybe the outcome wasn't so positive, but in conveying the lessons, you're able to convey some values about yourself that she can probably connect with.
You got to calibrate to your environment. If you're talking about a club, and for those of you listening, especially those of you who already know my material, you know that I'm not a club guy. I'm strictly relationships, long-term relationships, short-term relationships, open relationships. That's my thing. In terms of how to relate my material to a club, you got to remember that in a club environment, it's such a micro-universe that you're not going to be able to convey tons of information in that type of environment. You need to keep your stories in that environment upbeat and happy, and switch from one topic to the other, and have it almost be like, because there's so much going on that's competing for people's attention in a club. You've got to forget about your tonality in a club because you have to speak loud enough because the music is blaring, so you have to talk loud in the club just so the other person can hear you. My material is not designed to work in clubs. It's when you get out of the club and now you're talking to each other in a much more intimate setting.
Yeah, well, I think the idea of stories is sort of universal. It can work anywhere, but certainly you need to tailor it depending on what environment you're in. And telling a sadder, more somber story in a club probably isn't going to have the same effect as something that's upbeat, short, sweet, has a lot of DHVs in it. So obviously, like you said, you really need to tailor it depending on what venue you're in. We talked a little bit about creating stories, what good storytelling is, and the tonality that goes along with it. In terms of actually utilizing the stories, what's a great way to transition into a story and out from a story?
To transition from into a story and out of a story, you would use the themes. Pick a common theme in a story that you just finished telling, and say, that reminds me of, and then relate it to a theme. So let's say you and me were in a conversation, and you just finished telling me your story about getting the tricycle. I could sit here, and if I want to connect with you, or I want to take the conversation into another direction, I'll say something like, you just told me that story about you getting a tricycle and how much you loved it as a kid. It reminds me of watching Fraggle Rock when I was a kid. Because I so enjoyed that time. Just the same way that you loved that tricycle, I loved watching Fraggle Rock on Sunday nights. Because it was that one last reprieve of every weekend I would have. I would watch my Fraggle Rock on Sunday night before I would have to go back to Monday in school. And it was like, I knew that, okay, even though it's Sunday night and I really don't want to go to school the next day, at the very least, I had that Fraggle Rock that was my escape, and it was my fun. And, your tricycle took you on a ride. Well, Fraggle Rock took me on a ride. Mm-hmm. So I've just transitioned from one story to another that seemingly have nothing to do with one another. But because I connected it through themes, you not only feel, I'm assuming you feel that I'm listening to you because I've started mentioning things that you've talked about. Mm-hmm. Do you? If I start saying, you talked about in that story of yours when you got the tricycle, and I start relaying back certain things you've said in that story and relating it to themes of my own stories, you're going to feel that, wow, Frank was really listening to me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And do you find that there's a difference in the way that we tell stories to somebody that we've just met versus somebody that we've known for 10 years?
That goes without saying. When you've known somebody for 10 years, they'll be able to read you in ways that somebody brand new cannot read you. Somebody that you've known for years, sometimes it's nothing more than a facial expression will communicate exactly what it is they're thinking, and you have enough life experience with that person specifically that you don't have to verbalize it. A couple that's been together for 10 or 20 years will have nonverbal cues, sometimes just the sound of a voice or a look in the eye that says, uh-oh, something's wrong, or, oh, this person's trying to communicate something to me. They'll know each other. They can read each other that way. When you're talking to somebody brand new, you can't assume that you're going to interpret everything that they say and do in a way that you're used to. Mm-hmm. They may have had different life experiences. They might have different programming. So when you're talking to somebody new, my advice is you hit all of the sensory-rich descriptions, you hit that line with the thinkers, and I remember, and the lesson learned, and whatever it is they respond to, that's how you start learning about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very powerful. And, the other thing, that a great way to do it is, as well, to calibrate somebody is to actually have them tell you a story. And if you ask them a question that sort of elicits a story from them, listen to the words that they use to describe their own story. Are they talking about all the visual memories they have, or the sounds that they heard, or the feelings that they had, or the facts about the story, and then you can actually use that to help you calibrate as well.
Mm-hmm. That is a good way. My experience, though, says not everybody's comfortable revealing that side of themselves when they just meet you.
Wouldn't you say, though, that it's unconscious?
The fear, you mean?
No, I mean our preference to how we communicate, whether it's visual, auditory, kinesthetic. I mean,
yes,
generally will just come out automatically, and you can utilize that in order to find out how to structure your stories.
Okay, yes. I didn't understand the question. Yes, you're right. That part of it is unconscious. But when you're dealing with someone who's super shy, or maybe they've gotten burned in the past, trying to get them to open up, especially if you really want them to share that story about themselves, that could be even more challenging. And sometimes you get into a situation where you're trying to get somebody to open up and talk about themselves, and they don't want to open up, and they're very quiet, and they're very shy, and you're thinking, oh, they're just really not into me, I should move on. What I always suggest is you go in there, you tell your story first. You show them it's okay to be vulnerable with me because I'm going to open up first and be vulnerable with you.
Mm-hmm. Which is yet another reason why I think it's important that you do add some vulnerability into your stories. I mean, it may be considered by some of the guys in the industry as not necessarily being a good thing because, it's self-deprecating. But my feeling is that if you can show that you're a real human being and that you can show that you have, fears and you have feelings and you have, things that have gone wrong in your life that you've learned lessons from, I think that's an incredibly endearing quality, and people identify with those type of traits.
They can. However, I don't recommend that somebody starts off with a sincere vulnerability unless they've already got the other person interested in them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a certain time and place for everything.
Yeah, you don't go in and start talking about, hi, these are all the areas where I'm weak and feeling hurt from. You go in there, you find out a little bit about them. If you see they're a bit shy, let me tell you a story about my favorite childhood memory. Or you get onto that topic, you go through your spiel, and depending on how they respond. Now, again, if they're really shy, if they're really quiet, at that point, vulnerability, sharing one of your own, is a good thing. It lets them know that you're safe enough for them to open up with. However, if you're dealing with somebody who's already coming out there and is just as bombastic as you are, if not more bombastic, that's not a good time to be sharing vulnerability.
Certainly. And if you are, you're probably miscalibrating.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
So, Frank, are there some storytellers out there, or maybe some authors or some people that you admire or relate to, or think are really powerful storytellers? Maybe some resources that we can look up after the webinar. Okay, starting off with my own work, I have a 3-CD set on Frank storytelling that covers in depth a lot of the ideas we brought up, plus a few others I didn't bring up. As well, if you listen at least to the previews of those CDs, you're going to hear me critiquing live stories that the guys at the seminar that I gave were giving. We go line by line, and I critique their stories all the way through to the end. And in the third preview, you actually get a few full stories done with my system. Great. And we can get that at franktalks.com?
franktalks.com/social. Frank Talk, that has the page with my How to Build a Social Network, Frank Storytelling, and Art of Calibration programs, and all the previews are there that you can download and listen to for free.
Mm-hmm. So are there any presenters, authors, or anybody that you mentioned off the top of your head that are good, a good resource, somebody that's good to learn from as well, aside from your collection?
Believe it or not, children's storytellers and children's storybooks. They are the best place to go looking. Robert Munch is probably, in my opinion, one of the best storytellers out there, because he describes and talks about the stories that he's written in a way that keeps your attention. He comes up with a great rhythm with his voice. It keeps you captivated.
Right. Yeah, no, he's got some great stories, absolutely.
Dr. Seuss. You know, I can't even, I don't remember the specific words, but he wrote his books with the intention of making learning fun and easy for kids to pick up on. You know, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. And this type of thing where he uses different words that sound alike, sound the same. These are types of things that you can include into your storytelling.
Mm-hmm. And is there ever a time when you wouldn't want to use a story? You know, you may feel like you should use one, but it's not necessarily appropriate or not the right time in an interaction?
When your boundaries are being crossed, that's not a time for storytelling. That's a time for calling someone on their bull and saying, this is my boundary, and you're crossing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You know, that's like, I can understand the idea that, okay, let me tell you a little story about why I'm so unhappy with you. But if somebody is crossing your boundary, they may not be able to pick up the lesson through your story because, quite frankly, they don't want to look at it. They don't want to listen to it. So if you're talking with someone and they're doing something to cross over your boundary, if they're intelligent enough, if they are reasonable, they'll be able to pick it out of a story when you're telling them and communicating the idea of, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But if you're not dealing with someone who's reasonable or intelligent enough, or someone who may not even be interested in trying to figure out what it is you're trying to communicate, forget the storytelling, be direct, and tell them, look, I don't know how you were raised, but this for me is unacceptable, and I would appreciate it if you wouldn't do that again. I understand you probably didn't intend for it to come across that way, but that's exactly the way it's coming across. But, you know, a good example of this is you're hosting a social circle event, and somebody at your event is ruining the experience for others, and it's reflecting that on you because you brought everybody together. You need to take that person aside and talk to them privately and speak to them directly, and not through any storytelling, but through the main point of, this is the way it is, you're crossing my boundary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time, Frank, but I wanted to check in with you and see if there's anything else you wanted to add before we wrap this one up.
There is. And storytelling, in my experience, is not something that you're going to learn on the fly. Don't think that, oh, when I get into that situation with that girl, I'll remember to talk about X, Y, and Z. No, you won't. You'll be too nervous. You'll have other things going on. If you had that ability of doing it on the fly, you wouldn't be on this path to begin with. Those people who have the ability to remember those things and to do it on the fly, they figured this stuff out naturally years ago. They're not in the same category as you. You're here because you can't do it on the fly. Take an evening. Write down 5 of your best childhood memories, 5 of your peak life experiences, 5 things you love the most, your favorite day of the week, your favorite month, your favorite season, 5 things you really hate. The day of the week you hate the most, the month you hate the most, the season you hate the most. Write down a 1-paragraph freaking little story to express all that. That alone will give you 20 stories ready to go. You can take those base stories and throw them into my storytelling structure, use somebody else's structure, I don't care. But sit down and write down the goddamn freaking stories. That is the biggest thing that stops guys from mastering storytelling. They're lazy. They start saying, oh, wow, this would be really great, and I give them that list to do as homework. They don't do the homework, and the next time I read a post from them, they're asking, hey, can anybody else give me their stories? No, because you're lazy. You think that just reading other people's stories is going to be enough. It's not. For some reason, in every other area of life, everybody understands the idea that, hey, you got homework to do, you got to get a degree, you got to, do that internship, you got to learn as you go, you got to make it happen, you have to put in the time to become successful. And in every other area of life, guys get this, except their love lives. For some reason, when it comes to their love life, they're still they're still hypnotized by this idea that it's all going to work out. No, it's not. It's not all going to work out. If it was all going to work out, you wouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's a fear that's holding most guys back?
It's one of two things. either they really don't grasp the idea that when it comes to a love life, they have to put in the work just like any other area of life, or there's a deep fear of intimacy, whether it's a fear of sex or a fear of sharing oneself. Maybe they were abused as children. Maybe they have some sort of block. So this creative avoidance manifests itself, and they don't end up doing the homework. Mm-hmm. But it's one of the two.
All right, gentlemen, where I absolutely implore you to, after this call, go write down those things. Hopefully you've got some of that left over from last month, and you can just expand on some of those stories about your life, about your childhood, the things that you love, the things that you hate, and make sure to add in as many descriptive and emotional charging words as you possibly can. Make sure that you're hitting all 5 senses. Make sure that you're using some thinking words, and make sure that you've got some transitions down so you can easily go from one story to another, and you'll be a pro at this in no time. Frank, I want to thank you so much again for joining us for this webinar in August. Your insight is just so powerful. You've got so much good stuff to teach, and anybody out there who wants to learn more about Frank and his wonderful wisdom, you can check out www.franktalks.com, and all of his books and CDs are up there. And Frank, I know you're working on some new things coming up. Do you want to maybe tell us about some of that stuff?
Well, some of the things I'm working on are some projects for women. Basically, for every product I have for a man, I want to put out a product for a woman. And that's what's going on. In terms of other things, one of the biggest projects I have right now is that I'm looking to translate various pages on my website into different languages from around the world. And one of them is even going to be Klingon, if I can find a Klingon translator.
That's great.
So that's one of my fun projects that's happening. Fingers crossed, it's going to turn out. But my goal is to have 500 Frank Talks products, which would represent about 100 books and 400 CDs or data CDs.
Wow.
And I'm only at about 105 products right now, so I got about 400 more to go. And they're going to include all kinds of things, including as relationships progress and you're dealing with things like dating after death, how to deal with loss and grieving, products for just before you get married, and how to handle it when you think you might have married the wrong person. Mm-hmm. My goal is for Frank Talks to be a one-stop place for your entire life span development. And those are the things I'm working on, and that's where I want to take my future.
That's great, Frank. Well, it's a big goal, and we certainly wish you all the best with it. And just to all the guys out there listening who enjoy your material, we have shot 2 interviews with you that will be coming out very soon for the elite members. I'm sure everyone's going to really get a kick out of them as much as Mark and I did when we made them. So, Frank, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Mike, it's always a pleasure, and you can always count on me to stop by the men's room.
Awesome. Well, that's it for us this month, and we'll catch you next month.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the Calibrated Storytelling Seminar. Have you ever felt tongue-tied when talking to a woman and did not know what to say next? This seminar provides the structure to create personalized stories that connect to a woman's emotional needs. Calibration is about putting people into the categories and then modifying your behavior. Do you want to learn how to be truthful about who you are, but in an interesting and seductive way? If you want women to like you for the real you, then this seminar is for you. The Calibrated Storytelling Seminars and telephone consultations, only available at franktalks.com.